Today in the Smart Wood Shop, I'm going to show you how to make the main fence or the main face of this box joint jig so you can make any size box joint you choose. I'm Paulk, and this is the Smart Wood Shop. If you want to get a detailed set of plans to build a smart wood shop just like this for yourself or one of the Paulk Smart workbenches, there's a link in the description of this video down below where you can go and purchase plans and download them instantaneously, 24/7, 365. In a previous video, I showed you how to make and use this box joint jig from start to finish, including the main face that determines the size of box joint that you're making. Today I'm going to zoom in a little bit and make just the face. The rest of the box joint jig is universal. It doesn't matter what size box joint you're making. It's just this face that will determine how wide your box joint is. And that'll make a big difference to the aesthetic. If you want it to have thin fingers or thin boxes, or whether you want to have big, wide, thick ones, will all be determined by the size of router bit you choose to use. I made this one for 5/16 or 8mm box joints. That's what you see here. So today I'm going to actually make two. I'm going to make one for a 1/2 inch, or in my case a 12mm, and then the 1/4 inch. I go back and forth with the millimeter and the imperial dimensioning because most of my router bits are still imperial. Although as I buy new bits, I am trying to get my hands on the millimeter version if possible, just because I'm finding that when it comes to joinery and fine fitting things, I'm able to do the math a lot easier in my head with whole numbers rather than fractions. So if I go back and forth, just sub in whatever you're used to. It all is exactly the same. It's whatever router bit you choose to use. What I show you here today, you'll be able to take that and apply it to that size bit and get the box joint that you are going for. I have the blanks already made up for this finished fence. What I need to do now is finish it out for this specific router bit. The other day when I made this entire box joint jig and showed you how to do that, I made the piece for the face. I made a longer piece and I cut the T-track in the back all the way through it. And then I cut these all three to the exact length. So at this point, these two and this one before I did the detailing on it were identical. So I would recommend you do that when you make your box joint jig, is go ahead when you rip this material, rip a wider piece and go ahead and put your T-track on, because those dimensions will all be the same. Once you have these blanks made, then you can go ahead and separate them and start making up the different detailing depending on the bit you choose. Now I'm going to start by showing you how to do it with a 1/2 inch. And then to firm it up, I'm going to repeat the entire process. You're not going to learn anything new. You're just going to see me do it for this 1/4 inch, and you'll get to understand then the relationship and how the size of the bit will determine the size of the cut, the two notches that are made, and also critically the spacing of those notches, and then the spline that will go into that notch. So the spline is unique to the bit, and the notches are unique to the bit, and the spacing is unique to the bit. But after this video, you're going to have a complete understanding of that. Oh, one more thing. This little top dado is also specific to the bit you're using. This is an optional thing. It's just a storage place to put these pieces of spline that are only used for layout purposes. My thinking was making this dado was pretty easy because I'll have the bit that makes the cut, it makes the same size dado there, and then I'll have these splines or spacers stored on board, and I have everything I need once I pair it with the appropriate bit that matches to make that particular box joint size. The first step is to choose the bit. In my case, I have this 12mm bit. Now I use these spiral bits. The bits that I recommend for almost all of my routing and have really enjoyed them over the years for a number of different tasks are these upcut spiral. Upcut meaning they move and pull toward the router. So since the router is inverted, it's actually pulling it down. Now today, for this 1/2 inch, I actually have what's called a compression bit. I'm just starting to experiment with these. I'm finding that, at least early on with plywood, that I am getting a little better cut on both sides. With the upcut, I tend to get a little more blowout. But again, that's still my go-to for now. I'm just starting to experiment with these. As I get more experience with these and I can really test them out on some solid woods and stuff, I may recommend them in the future. But for now, I'm just testing them out. And today you'll get to see how it works because we'll do a test cut once we get it built up. Now I've chosen my bit, I'm going to put it in the router. The second step is to set the height of the cutter. The way I do that is to take the box joint jig. If I set this tip right to the top of it, then I'd get no cut at all. It would be flush. From that point, I'm going to set it up 10mm. Now the reason that this is important is the size or thickness of material that I use. I oftentimes, and most of the time, will use 12mm plywood, also referred to as 1/2 inch, but if you put calipers on it, you're going to find that it is closer to 7/16, and actually specifically I find that almost all of it is 12mm, and that's when you go buy a sheet of 1/2 inch material in the stores in the US, you're going to find that most of the time they are 12mm. When I'm setting up to make the cut after everything is done, I'll actually be using the material and setting the cutter slightly higher than the thickness of the material. But this cut is set lower than the thickness of the material. In this case, I'm going to 10mm. Now I use 10mm regardless of the size of the bit. So with the 5/16, I set the height at 10mm. With 1/4 inch, I set the height of the bit at 10mm. With 1/2 inch, I set the height of the bit at 10mm. That's 10mm above the base of the box cutter. This is going to make the bit lower than the thinnest material that I use. And I'll explain why that is important in a couple of minutes. The next step is to attach the box joint jig itself to the router table. Next, I'll install one of the blanks. And I'm centering it up so it's flush on both sides. This first cut is going to be dead center in the blank. I'm going to fire the router up now and pass it all the way through this main fence and into the backer fence as well, but not all the way through the backer fence. So now I have this cut that is 12mm wide. Doesn't really matter what it is, it's the bit. Whatever the diameter of the bit is, that's the size of the cut, and the depth is at 10mm. My next step now is to make up the spline. I'm going to cut a single piece that's long enough to make both of these and the permanently installed piece of spline for stepping off the box joints. I used hardwood in the previous video, and I have always done that, and I have no problem with that. But to make it a little easier, today I'm going to actually use the same material that the box joint jig is built from, which is 18mm plywood. So I'm going to start with going over to the table saw, and I'm going to rip a piece that is a tiny bit wider than this opening. I'm going to target this width, but it'll probably be a little wide, and I'm going to fit it in. I don't want it to be loose at all, but I also don't want to have to pound it in. There's a reason for that. When we cut the second notch and we actually install that spline in the second notch, not the first, when we are stepping off the cut that we're doing, we're actually using it, we don't want it so tight that we're having to force it down. We want a good fit so that it doesn't wiggle, but we also don't want to be forcing it every time. So I'm gonna, again, sneak up on that, get the width right. Once I have that right, then I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees and I'm going to cut it so that it is 10 millimeters thick so that it will be flush on the bottom of the fence. We'll talk about that over at the table saw, but I wanted you to know ahead of time when the saw is running what I'm doing. Also with plywood, I'm going to be cutting it so that the direction that the laminations run is the width of the cutter. So because I don't want to be screwing it on and going, the screw will go in through the bottom, it'll be glued and screwed into here just like this one, and I don't want to be splitting the laminations when I'm putting that screw in. So that's important, is to get my orientation for that first width, the width of the cutter, to be along the grain this way and not across it, or with the laminations, I mean. I dug through my scrap pile and found a perfect little rip here. I'm going to set the height of the table saw blade to just slightly above the thickness of the material. I'm going to use this long and possibly this short push block to push this thin material through. It's going to allow me to hold it down, keep it tight to the fence, but keep my hands away from it. When I'm working with really thin material, and it's even going to be thinner when I rotate it on its edge to rip it the other way, I really don't want my hands in there. So I highly recommend a push block that's got some beef to it and a little push lip on it so that you can push it through, keep it safe, and keep your hands safe. Now I have this one long piece that is the right width for the cutter and the right thickness so it's flush with the bottom of the fence. First thing I'm going to do is cut a 50 millimeter piece. That's going to be the permanent piece that is glued and screwed in to the second notch we're going to cut in the face. And then what's left, I'm going to make two pieces that are about 125 millimeters long. Again, those are just spacers. They're not really used in or applied in any way to the cutter. They're just for setup purposes. So you can see that the laminations run across this way, and I'm going to put it in like that so the screw will be going through the laminations, not splitting the laminations. With the spline cut, the next step is to cut the second notch. This will be the notch that the 50 millimeter spline is mounted to. To make the second notch, I'll load the fence in and then take the two long splines, these are the ones for setup only, and I'm going to put them on the edge here and set up so that they're flush on this edge and that the fence is tight to it. Now it's important that I put them in the direction that is the width of the cutter. If I did them this way, the 10 millimeter direction, then it would be wrong, the cut would be wrong, and it wouldn't, your box joint wouldn't work out for this cutter. So once I know that they're in that orientation, I just butt them up tight to each other, make sure they're flush to the edge. I'll push the fence up, I'll feel with my fingers. Hardly any way to be more precise than by feel. So I pushed it up good and tight, I'm flush, and then I'm going to crank it down. This gives me 2 times the width of my cutter, so it'll give me an exact width between this notch and the next notch that's equal to the width of the blade. And by the way, this is the only time that you will offset the fence. It's just for this one cut to mount the spline. After this, the fence will always be perfectly flush on both edges. This is also where the 10 millimeter height of your bit comes into play. I'm going to cut the second notch at 10 millimeters high and the width of the bit. I'm going to install this, it's going to fit flush, But the height of this first one will then grow when I cut 1/2 inch material. I'm going to set the bit higher. It's going to cut this higher. If I go with 3/4 inch material to do a box joint with, then I'll set the cutter to slightly above that, and this notch will even grow some more. It doesn't really matter at that point. It has nothing to do with the how the box joints fit together in this direction. It only has to do with how long these fingers are, so that they're long enough that when we put it together, they protrude slightly so we can sand them and make a nice fit. To install this permanent spline, it's going to be glued and screwed into place. The screw is never going to come in contact with the bit because it's always offset to the right side, so it's okay to put a screw in it. But if you do have concerns, you could just glue it and clamp it in place as well. The glue will hold it. Take note that the spline is protruding to this side of the fence, the outside. The T-track is on the back side. I've assembled these incorrectly where I've had this, I wasn't paying attention, and had the spline sticking out the back. Had to take it all apart and do it again. With the spline installed, it's flush across the bottom and it's flush across the back, and it's sticking out in the front. Now it's time to make a test cut. I'm going to flush it up, and I know by doing that that's going to line this bit up perfectly with where the first notch is. And this is also where it's critical that you locate the box joint jig. In my case, with my version, it fits on the Paulk Smart router table. It's the Paulk Smart box joint jig only because I have used the 32mm system to mount it, which locates it front and back and also centers it right on the bit. So I know that when I drop in these two bench dogs, it's lining it up every time. If it were slightly off, if you were doing it with clamps and you got off a little bit, then your cut would be sloppy. Now to actually use it, just like in the past video, I'm going to set up the height of the bit. Now I'm going to roll it up so that it's slightly higher than the thickness of the material. I have a 1/2 inch box joint. Now I did set the bit probably a little higher than I needed to. It's slightly proud, so that means I have to do a little more sanding on both edges. So I probably set the bit down just a little bit more if I were fine tuning. And also on the width of the material, there is about 1.5 millimeters left over on this side. In that case, you know, I'd either do the math, so ahead of time I'd have these an exact layout, or maybe a half layout, so I had a half a box joint on either end, which looks really good. What I'd do in this case, if I ended up with all my parts cut, I would run these through the table saw and take off that tiny amount so that I would then have this perfect layout. The final step to finish up this fence is optional. This is where I am going to put the dado across the top so that I can store these pieces of spline, these spacers. To make this cut, I'm going to set up the fence so that the center of the cutter is centered in the material. To set the height of the bit for the depth of this dado that I'm going to do, I'm not going to go the full 10 millimeters. I'm going to do something less than that so this sticks up just a little bit. It's a little easier to get it out if I do that. I want to make sure this cut is set up just right, so I'm going to run a little piece of scrap through for a test cut. Now it's complete. I'm going to write 12 millimeter on the back of this. And I know in the future all I have to do is get out the 1/2 inch or 12 millimeter bit, and everything else I need is here, and then attach it to the box joint jig, and I'm off to the races. Now I'm going to make one for the 1/4 inch bit without talking. Roll the music. I have a single box joint jig with 3 different fences, which gives me 3 different joints. A 1/4 inch, 5/16, and a 1/2 inch. All of it, no sneaking up on it. It's just a perfect fit every time. If you enjoy these videos, if you've learned anything, if you'd like to see me make more, be sure to give me a thumbs up and subscribe. Thanks for dropping into the Smart Woodshop. You stay safe and have a great day.